to Activism Munich. I'm your host, Zain Raza. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Reconstructing Reality, where we discuss a wide range of issues with a historical and philosophical context. Joining us today is author, political commentator and historian Vijay Prashad. Vijay Prashad is also a professor of international relations at Trinity College in Connecticut, USA. He's also the author of 17 books. Some of his books include No Free Left, The Future of Indian Communism, and The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South. Vijay Prashad, glad to have you on.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
So Vijay, I want to talk about the current socio-economic conditions of our globe. And before I do that, in your book, The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South, you'd have two categories, the Global North and the Global South. Could you talk about these two categories and then update us about the current predicament there?
Well, the categories Global South and Global North indicate geography, but they're not merely about geography. So in other words, it is true that there were certain parts of the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, that had been colonized by Europe principally, and then of course the United States, through the 18th, 19th and 20th century. So it's also the case that these areas, these zones, Asia, Africa, Latin America, emerged in the 20th century as actors in their own right. They won freedom from colonialism. They created their own project, which I consider the Third World Project. Then these parts of the world went into a terrible debt crisis, largely fueled by international banking. And it is in the aftermath of this debt crisis that you see these zones of the world in Africa, Asia, Latin America, that struggles against what we call neoliberalism emerge. And it's really these struggles against neoliberalism, against the privatization of everything around them, against the sale of government assets at very low prices to private bidders. It's the struggles against all this that create, for me, the category Global South. And as these struggles enter Europe and the United States, in many ways, these struggles inside Europe are also the Global South within the Global North. So on the one side, this refers to geography. On the other, it refers to a state of struggle.
So could you update us on the current economic and social condition in these areas that you indicated?
Well, it's no surprise to anybody. You'd have to be blind. You'd have to be, absolutely unable to be, have any feeling if you don't see the immense amount of poverty in the world.
The stock markets, sorry to break you down, the stock markets keep going up and we are reaching new record-breaking, the NASDAQ or in DAX in Frankfurt. That's why it's like, for a lot of people, confusing what's actually going on.
Well, for the last 30 years, we've had a very interesting kind of economics, which we call jobless growth, where you'll have, stock markets booming for very complicated and yet rather simple reasons, at the same time as you'll have people unable to find work. I mean, it's the contradiction between the growth rates rising and the unemployment rates or underemployment rates also rising that perplexes people. But this shouldn't actually perplex you in places like Europe or indeed in the United States, where there is a very large number of people who, through situations such as outsourcing, where use of labor in Asia, use of labor in Africa, use of labor in Latin America, and of course in the former Soviet bloc has, in a sense, cheapened the price of international labor. Jobs have gone overseas, but corporations which are still based in the Global North but have their work done overseas are posting high growth rates, are posting, very good profit rates. So you'll have the DAX go up because German companies are doing very well, but that doesn't mean that they are necessarily employing people inside Europe or employing people inside the United States. So you're going to have in these zones, underemployment and yet high stock markets. And in places like Asia, Africa, Latin America, where there are new jobs coming, these jobs come at such poor quality for labor that their inequality is not being addressed at all. In other words, people are getting more equal. The very rich are getting richer, the very poor are poor. People are working very hard across the planet. It's not that they're not working. Productivity rates are up. And yet, because of the way in which global corporations have been able to take charge of the organization of economic activities, you'll have high stock market activity, and yet you'll have a very poor condition for the majority of the people in the planet.
You talked about debt. Almost every country that we hear on the news is in debt. So the question is, who owes who what debt?
Well, I mean, you're sitting in Germany, which is not in debt. The problem with the way the world economic order is organized is that there are always going to be some countries that are surplus holding countries, whether Germany or China or whatever. But the question isn't who's holding surplus, who's holding debt. What do you do with the global inequality? In the 1970s, the IMF tried to, under a very interesting leader, tried to propose a reasonable social democratic approach to debt, where the IMF would, in a sense, take large amounts of the world's surplus and would recycle this in socially productive ways. This is precisely the point at which the IMF was basically cut down at the knees, was made to bow down before the kind of neoliberal principles, and there was no opportunity to think about recycling debt in a socially responsible manner. So you will get surplus holding countries, you will get very many countries in the world in debt, but no principle of how to recycle the debt, how to create opportunities for people, how to remove the situation of global inequality. There is simply no real principles being discussed at the tables of powerful people.
So let's dig deeper into this historical perspective, because it's quite common to hear, if you ask the common person, that it's, for example, Germany's success is based on its working culture and mentality, and it's superior to some countries in Latin America or Southeast Asia. Would you agree that the working culture plays a role in this and is a decisive factor in economic success, or are there institutional reasons why the global South has fallen behind?
Well, look, it would be silly for me to say that it plays no role. Obviously, working culture plays a role, but it doesn't play a decisive role. That's the word you used. It's an important word. It doesn't play a decisive role. The decisive role, to my mind, is played by the way the rules are written. So, for instance, in the 1980s and 1990s, when the World Trade Organization was being created, and then, of course, when it gets into motion, a set of principles emerged that advantaged countries of the global north, such as, for instance, the new rules on intellectual property rights, or, for instance, the way in which finance was able to, dominate, the kind of decision making around investment for the social good, but also for industrial, development. So the rules that were written by the global north, largely under pressure from the so-called G7 countries, those rules, put countries into a bind. It forced them, into a situation of, producing, working from debt. In other words, they were already in a position of weakness in terms of the north, and that weakness was built upon. So, the decisive problem for global inequality is certainly the rule making and then the rules that now exist. But given that these rules exist, other factors are of course important. It would be ridiculous to say that these other factors such as work culture play no impact. I think, a sober-minded person would recognize that they play an impact. But really, if you are honest about history and the data before us, you'd understand that the principal problem is not culture, but is power and rule making.
So Vijay, let's pause here, and in the next episode talk about an alternative economic model and the policies that it should entail. Vijay Prashad, author, political commentator, and historian, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And that is all from the team in Munich. I'm your host, Zain Raza. Thank you for joining us on Reconstructing Reality.